Very warm welcome to our webinar on reward and remuneration in Africa. My name is Oliver Nathan. I think before we kick off, I will start with a very brief presentation, or rather a flash of our slide on our new ways of working Pan-African Insights study, which we would really like you to complete if you have not completed already. So let me quickly just flash my slide. In one moment. Yeah, so this is basically our study. We're in year 2 of our study, and we would really appreciate your completion of this to give us the data that we need to really start to get to grips with and understand new ways of working across the continent. I'm going to pop a link into the chat for you to please complete the new ways of working survey, and we will make mention of it at the end of the webinar. So other than that, let me introduce you to my colleague, Mr. Nicol Mullins, who will be leading our webinar today. Nicol comes with a vast wealth of experience with regards to reward and remuneration consulting and doing work for our clients across the continent.
Yeah, thank you, Ollie. I appreciate it. Hi, everybody. So I am joining you today from my son's school as we are having a Father's Day. So I quickly just took a break. And I think if I have to reflect on whether this would have been kind of possible in the last couple of years, I highly doubt it. So please excuse me for a bit of informality. I know that some of you are sitting at home with a suit jacket on top and shorts at the bottom. I hope not in bathing suits, any of you. It's quite chilly today where we are in South Africa, but I also know that we've got people joining us not just from across the continent, but also globally. So thank you very much for everybody that has joined us on this call. We're going to work through the deck that we have prepared in the next couple of slides that I'm going to take you through. And we will spend the bulk of the time discussing some of these components that we have raised. But what we would also like to hear from you is, what would you like to see more of in the future? So you'll note that in our last slide, we will be bringing up what is it that you would like to hear more of. In this context, we are really focused on the African continent, and we want to make sure that Africa takes its rightful place within the world order. And we want to be part of the change and contributing to the change on the African continent. So the title of today's session is Welcome to the World of Reward and Remuneration Across Our Continent. Now, I've been very fortunate in my career to have worked across about 45 African countries, traveling to these countries from Senegal across to Kenya, and then from Kenya all the way down to South Africa, working everywhere in between. There's 2 countries that I really still want to visit during my time. It is Somalia and Liberia. I would like to also make a short stopover in Freetown, Sierra Leone, where apparently the economy is booming to a great extent. And I know that some organizations are setting up fintech organizations in Liberia. So I'm really looking forward to see what comes out of that part of the world in the next coming years. So we're really going to be touching on, and I hope you can see it, what we're going to be talking about. If you can see it, pop it in the chat. I would love to see if anyone noticed what we will be talking about and what we will not be talking about. But if you're vigilant, you will see that there is one small black dot on the screen on the bottom right-hand corner. And that is really what we are going to touch on today within this reward sphere that we are going to talk about. A lot of organizations are talking about EVPs, and some organizations have started to talk about IVPs. Hi, Doris, welcome as well to the session. And I don't think many organizations have achieved this future state of having a comprehensive EVP and less so an IVP. So EVP, acronym for Employee Value Proposition, IVP, Individual Value Proposition. We are battling with returning to the office, working from home, finding flexibility. And the Google CEO wrote a beautiful article. He said that there are 3 components that should be encompassed in a return to work policy. He said purpose. What is the reason and why are we going back to the office? Secondly, flexibility around, do we give people the flexibility to work a specific roster from home? And I'm talking to another client. It's quite interesting that they haven't adopted 2 days in the office, 3 days from home, but they rather said 5 days a month in the office. So I thought I was just thinking about it a little bit differently. And the last component that you raised was choice, allowing employees the flexibility to see. I just want to confirm, I see Ruth says she cannot see the slides. I just want to double check. Can everybody else just give me a thumbs up, or in the chat if you can see the slides? Okay, so Ruth, I think it might be on okay. Okay, so let me just quickly try this. Okay, and now, can you see the slides now? If you can just give me a thumbs up or a confirmation. Okay,
see the slides,
perfect.
my side, Nicole. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you very much. So here's the agenda that we are going to walk through today. And this is what you would have received in the invite. Setting up reward and remuneration policies and systems that attract and retain the best talent and demonstrates an enhanced return on investment for companies in Africa is a key area of work for us. This is one of the components that we really strive to enable. And our tagline for our organization is unlocking business growth through people insight. So that's really placing people at the heart of our business. So this is a little bit what you might feel like in HR in general at multiple times during the course of the year. 30th of October, 1974, Muhammad Ali and his rival battled it out in Zaire, now DRC, Rumble in the Jungle. And there was an airplane on standby for Muhammad Ali because they said that his opponent was going to knock him out within the first couple of rounds. But what Muhammad Ali did was he went to DRC a couple of months before this bout actually took place, and he climatized. He met with the people, he socialized with them, and he got their buy-in. And he ended up winning this boxing match in DRC with a very famous strategy in boxing, which is called the rope-a-dope, where you absorb the energy by leaning on the ropes, and therefore it lessens the impact of the blow that your opponent dealt to you. So he was definitely overpowered physically, but he had the ability to absorb these punches. And for me, this is a little bit what it feels like, as I've mentioned in HR, specifically after bonus rounds, annual salary review rounds. And what we want to talk through today is just talk about the basics around how do we create structure where there is an unstructured approach. There's a very nice framework called the Kinnivan framework. Talks about 4 phases: simple, chaos, complicated, and complex. And I think many things in the reward space are complicated. It means that if we look at it holistically, if we just take a Boeing as an example, you can take it apart. It's possible to take apart piece by piece and then reassemble the Boeing once again if you have the manual. So what we want to touch on today is really to say, how do we start the specific process? One of the models that I often lean back on is the McKinsey 7S model. It consists of 3 hard S's, which is the top 3 S's: strategy, structure, and systems, and then followed by the 4 soft S's, which is skills, styles, staff, and in the middle is shared values. Now, shared values is a synonym for culture. So what is the organizational culture about? I'm reading an interesting book called The 9 Lives of Work by Marcus Buckingham and another co-author. And they talk about the distributive culture in an organization, that pockets of excellence do exist, that you cannot actually talk about a broad culture within an organization specifically. So on the next slide, as life might have it, we've got the final agenda setting. We're going to talk about the remuneration system. We're going to talk about job grading, introduction to rewards, and then closing remarks, focusing and touching slightly on governance and when, I want to say, pressure is applied on the system and to you as a reward professional. So from a remuneration system point of view, there's different components that one can evaluate in this specific structure. And it consists of a broader ecosystem in terms of which we operate. So we've got a quick poll up onto on the agenda. And the poll is reward and remuneration of strategic importance to your organization? There are 5 options for you to walk through. So Ollie, if you can bring up the poll for us, and then we will give it just a few moments for the participants to answer. I was on LinkedIn and I saw that another person posted and asked, does your executive team understand your reward philosophy? And some people said yes. definitely the minority. And then the second follow-up question was, does the rest of your employees understand the reward philosophy? And the bulk of the people said, no, they don't. So for me, I once again understand in the development of a philosophy, it's critical. And before we get to the poll, this is where I want to talk about this specific mirror and map principle that Professor Nick Benadell shared with myself and a couple of peers a couple of years ago. And this photo and where we want to go is where we want to get to. This is basically our map. But we also need to have a mirror, and that's the reflection in the water that we need to look at. Is to say, if we want to go on this specific journey, we have to have a map. We need to know where we are going, but we also have to have a mirror to reflect on where we should make specific changes. I often hear that organizations say that it has worked for us in the past, why change something that has worked? And it is an opportune time to make specific tweak and changes, not always radical change, but specific tweaks and changes in terms of that. So from a poll outcome, it's quite tight at the top. Most people combined, about 70% of the respondents said that it's a priority, but not the priority. And then the second is mission critical for us. One person responded to say that it's not important at all. So different organizations are definitely in different life cycles, and their ability to adapt and enhance in this process is critical. So from a remuneration systems point of view, this is a framework that we've put together through another piece of research. And we said that these are the main components that forms part of the remuneration system, not the only components, but big drivers. We start off at the base of the pyramid. We say that the remuneration strategy and policy serves as the guiding document for what you would like to achieve as an organization. Those documents potentially encompasses several structures. Like from a King 4 principles point of view, we want to cover fixed pay, variable pay, retention bonuses, lump sum payments, ex gratia payments, the malus and clawback components, and then finally for prescribed officers, what are their remuneration? And that forms the pillar on the left-hand side. That's the governance component that we need to talk about. And then we can start in the middle part. So the remuneration strategy and policy informs what we need from a payroll administration and HRIS point of view. We might not have a big population size, and we can come away with working with Excel. Ironically, I find that many organizations that have spent millions on SAP implementation, Oracle, Workday, still prefer to mine their data in an Excel format. Some organizations are applying Power BI and subscribing to other software as a service applications, also known as SaaS services, to enable them to better work with their data and create greater insights. Then, depending on the structure and the size of our organization, organizations will implement job grading. Job grading is one of the components that we're going to talk about. And job grading then gives input to where potential structured pay ranges are drafted. So there's various approaches when it comes to pay ranges. You can do spot pricings, market pricings if your organization is fairly small and you have the ability to choose and to see where specific positions are paid. This is a prevalent practice in the US. But in Europe, Africa, and Asia, more prevalent is to have job grading rolled out. And I've seen now and there that organizations have started to roll out grades for families, which brings that more administration. The next component is performance management. Don't necessarily like the term performance management. I think performance enablement, crucial conversations, calibration is of value. And we haven't seen a real shift in that part of the world in the way that organizations are treating performance management. That book that I referred to earlier, 9 Lies of Work, said, people don't want feedback. People don't want performance management. People just want attention. And to have the ability to have crucial conversation, also known as brave conversations with reportees and in the broader organization, obviously, of course, subject to your culture and psychological safety that's created, is essential. Then recognition can play a significant role as well. And recognition can be anything from a high five, pat on the back, a few days off, flexible working arrangements, to monetary reward. Often recognition is non-monetary in nature. But this can also be, and what we've seen dwindling out is the long service award culture with people changing roles more frequently. And all of this is then underpinned by incentives. Typically, the performance management can be one of the outflows into the incentives. And how do we track this? With a pillar on the right-hand side. Scorecards and metrics. Peter Drucker said, you will get what you measure. And there's a professor in South Africa, Herman Singh. He's a professional digital, I think, innovation. He's also non-executive director. I saw him made a post on LinkedIn this morning. He said, People said that there's a bounty for Cobra. So it started off with you will get what you measure. He says that there will be bounty offered for dead Cobras. And then what ended up happening is that people started Cobra farms. So how they can particularly manipulate the system. So I often say when we design sales incentive schemes, I can design what I think is the best possible fit for the organization, but there will be a salesperson in this company that will find loopholes. So we also like to include those people in the design process. So the three that we're really going to focus on and what is critically important is job grading, pay ranges, and performance management. If you've set up the base, the remuneration strategy and the policy, which in an ideal world should be at the onset, but seldom is, it gives for a great base of departure and strong foundation because it gives you that policy and that framework in terms of how reward will be implemented in the organization. But if you do not have that, often these remuneration strategy and policies do exist, not explicitly in the organization, but implicitly. So thinking about where organizations benchmark, this will actually filter through those specific structures. So our specific approach as an organization to remuneration management is one that has been rolled out globally for quite some time, but I think it really works quite well when implemented in an organization and followed a specific structure. It allows the ability to dissect the person from the reward. So it's referred to as the 3P model. So first of all, you pay for a position where the remuneration structure, the grading is done agnostic without taking the person into consideration. The second pillar of the 3P model is paying for the person. So this is where you can bring in where it's either a critical skill or it's not a specifically competent person or fully at full competency levels or proficient in a specific role. So there's a lack of competencies and room for development. So you either pay at a discount, which would mean you pay a lower salary than the reference salary. Reference salary is typically the midpoint of your market data. And that midpoint is often referred to, and this is a term that I got from British American Tobacco a couple of years ago, probably 12 years ago, as the market anchor. So they say, where do we anchor our market? Where would we ideally want to pay our staff, whether it's the 50th percentile, 75th percentile? And if these terms do not make sense to you now, I'm going to get to that terminology in a little bit to talk about that. The third pillar is pay for performance. And this is really driven by an individual. And many organizations can have an organizational component tied to this when it comes to the calculation of the bonus, and often that is. But this is where the performance management would kick in, where you can make a differentiation and you can create long-term incentives, typically incentives, bonuses, variable remuneration that stretches over a longer period of time, typically in our world more than 12 months. And then short-term incentives is typically incentives that are paid and achieved within 12-month period. And then we've got commissions, and we also got shorter incentives that are potentially rolled out, which can be driven for sales commissions paid depending on the life cycle of the selling cycle of the product. So this 3P model is a good way to, I want to say, talk to the business about what do we typically pay for the position? Because what often happens in organizations, if we recruit, let's say we're recruiting for a finance manager, what did we pay the previous finance manager? And that becomes what we would refer to as our reference salary. We might add a percentage to it, and that becomes our base for departure. Whereas in this specific model, we can refer back to what do we pay for this position? How does the person compare to the position? Do they deserve a premium? Can they be paid above the market anchor at what we would refer to as a higher compa ratio, or below the market anchor at a discount? And then over time, their performance starts to play a role in their overall reward that they are compensated for. The second component is talking about job grading. And job grading allows us to put a specific structure in place. And if you reflect back on one of the first slides that I shared around the McKinsey 7S model, the second S is structure. So ex-colleague of mine always said, and this is, I think, a well-known saying, is that structure follows strategy. If you don't know which direction you are going, how do you know how to structure for that specific component? And in our first New Ways of Working study, one of the developmental areas for organizations, and as you post in the chat, please feel free to answer these questions. What do you think job grading is all about? And how is job grading linked to remuneration? But one of the developmental areas identified in our first study was the ability to conduct workforce planning, and more so strategic workforce planning in a changing environment. Now, we can't plan the workforce if we don't know in which direction the strategy is going to take us. And oftentimes I find when we start to ask a few questions of the business, they are not clear. They are potentially clear on their strategic intent, but not their actual strategy and their final commitment to resources. So strategic workforce planning is a very neat outflow from the business strategy, and it talks about the alignment between business strategy and people strategy in this specific sphere. So what job grading is not about the personalization, the person in the role, or the individual. However, any person that tells you that names will not come up during the job grading system, or that there isn't some level of subjectivity in the process, I cannot see how you cannot say that at 100% commitment that there's no subjectivity. There is a portion of subjectivity, but what you aim to do through this process is reduce the subjectivity by being aware of the biases, potentially grading this in a committee setup where there's multiple voices in the room, and the ability to include different voices, and also to hold each other to account when roles are graded and when people are talking about their specific roles. Now, there are various grading systems that exist in the world, and I've just on this continuum plotted some of the systems that exist. One of the main questions that we get is, when must we grade our jobs? And I want to say almost the answer is it depends, classical consulting answer. If you want to start, I want to say 15, 20 people, more or less, when there's a need to govern a little bit better and the ability to differentiate in compensation, that might be a great starting point for a job grading point of view. Now, it doesn't always need to be scientific. If we lean to the right of this continuum, where there's a customized grading system, there is a higher level of reliability, objectivity, transparency, and reliability in the system. So from a research point of view, we'll just talk about validity and reliability. And the ability to be able to defend where you have come stems on the right-hand side, a customized system or a job grading system. Internationally recognized job grading systems, Willis Towers Watson is one of them, Mercer IPE, Korn Ferry grading methodology. There's several that exist. In an South African context, many organizations use a system called Patterson in their specific structure. And it is a purely South African system developed, I think, in the 70s by a gentleman. But then you also have the ability to rank or slot roles. So this is more of an informal approach. Or you can go the route of what we referred to earlier on, spot pricing or market pricing. So the market pay rate actually determines the hierarchy in the organization. So job grading, the way that I also structure this for myself is that job evaluation is the process in terms of how you allocate scores, coordinates, points, vectors, dimensions to a specific role. The outcome of the evaluation of a job is what we refer to as the grading. Now, it really ranks the jobs in a specific hierarchy from the bottom to the top. And some organizations have undertaken this exercise many years ago. Some organizations have a standing committee that they actually run this through. We work with quite a large organization, employs about, I think, 40,000 people, where they've got 4 permanent job evaluation specialists in the specific organization. That's their role. They sit at committee meetings with different stakeholders, and they continuously evaluate jobs as they restructure, as job openings come up. But many organizations would have done this maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, never have done this before, take an informal approach. And this really is the portion of laying strong foundations in any organization, is to make sure that your job grading, this removes an emotional connection in terms of where people think their positions are placed versus having an objective approach looking at specific factors. The system that Africa People Advisory Group uses is referred to as Engage. There are 5 decision grids, and I want to share with you, I'm just using this as an example. There are multiple iterations of this, and often organizations use similar structures: impact, control, knowledge, risk. And what we look at is 5 grids: technical skills grid, managerial and persuasive, also known as the communication skills grid, followed by 2 additional grids in the context of the organization, the impact grid and the control grid. And these specific grids say, well, what is the revenue, headcount, all sized by businesses? These are some of the factors that are taken into consideration. Multiple approaches that can be taken in this specific sphere. But as I've mentioned, it creates that disconnected emotional connectedness from thinking where you think the role is evaluated to where it is evaluated. I find it interesting when I have these ratification meetings, people say, in my opinion, this role is a 7 or this role is a 6. And when I ask, now, in your opinion, what are the factors that you weigh up? And it's seldom it's more than one factor that is weighed up. So this provides a robust, objective process in that specific context. So what you can do as an outflow from this is compare jobs internally. And it really is an enabler for benchmarking. So we can draw our pay ranges from this, then see how competitive are our people positioned to our benchmarked market. We can determine our salaries. Do we pay at a premium or a discount? This is where we bring in the 3P model around paying for position. Then we plot the people against their specific structured pay ranges. And as part of your annual salary review process, depending on the volatility, and we are really experiencing some high volatility globally, if we just look at the inflation rates, Malawi has had a devaluation of the currency last week with 25% to prompt up their foreign reserves, to boost their export markets. We'll probably see in the next couple of months that there will be a market reaction with increases given. It's interesting for me to see that organizations like the US, UK, France, Belgium are nearing the double-digit inflation mark. And it will be interesting for me to see where they go and how they will follow. Doing this for several years, we have seen, and an ex-colleague of mine and I did some research in 2017 that said that when inflation exceeds 10%, you can say between 10 and 11%, there's typically a disconnect between a company's ability to give inflation and inflation. So then there's typically a disconnect between what organizations give and the inflation. That same colleague, Dirk, has now taken up a position at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, and there'll be some interesting research coming out of that in the next couple of months. This is typically what a pay range would look like. So I want to talk about 2 things. We talk about either a salary band or a pay range, but then you can get pay ranges or salary bands. This can also be referred to as a pay structure in some organizations. A policy that, or an approach that we follow is to say, let's divide our pay range. So pay range is looking at the rate of pay for one grade only. And when you plot several pay ranges next to each other, that's when you craft an overall pay range or salary bands for an organization, where we can talk about width, regression, spread, midpoint differentials, overlap in terms of that specific structure from a technical point of view. Now, in our approach, we say that let's divide each and every single pay range into specific zones. And we've just used 5 zones as an example. I've worked with organizations where there are 3 zones, where there are 7 zones, or where there is an actual ideal compare ratio. We're going to talk about compare ratios a little bit later, but compare ratios is really how do you compare against the market expressed as a ratio, so expressed as a percentage. So if it exceeds 100, you're above. If it is below 100, you are below the market. So zone 1 would typically be for entry-level people in the organization, those not 1 to 2 years experience, not established in their role. Zone 2 for people who are not fully yet competent, but have developed in the role. And zone 3 is where you want to have your competent on-par performance position. Zone 4 and zone 5 is where you move to your star performance. And zone 5 is really where you have your individuals ready for career progression. So this is also something, if you move in a zone, it's typically referred to as progression. When you move from one zone to another zone, it's typically called a promotion, a band promotion, but you can have a role promotion and still remain in the same band within an organization. So you can also have people below the minimum, people above the maximum of this role. And Old Mutual has a beautiful term for people below and people above. People below, they refer to as bricks, and people above the maximum, they refer to as bubbles. Organizations might also refer to them as red circles and green circles, and you will have to have a specific approach for people who are paid over or below the specific market ranges in your organization. The next component is just referring to around the introduction to rewards on a broader system. And if we look about broader rewards in this organizational context, it is unique to each organization. If I think about the continent and we think about West Africa, Franco-speaking Africa, or rather Francophone Africa, Lusophone Africa, which typically Portuguese, Angola and Mozambique, Equatorial Guinea to a certain extent, Guinea-Bissau in the West, and then also Saxophone Africa or Anglophone Africa, there's typically different remuneration structures that are employed in these markets. Francophone Africa, typically multiple allowances that exist in the market, a basic salary, then an additional salary, which is your sous-salaire, which is the premium salary on top of the local mandated salary with multiple allowances. And that remuneration approach is typically referred to as the guaranteed cash approach. Whereas many organizations would follow what we refer to as a base plus model. So you would have your basic salary, some allowances, a 30th check, and then specific benefits as part of your EVP structuring. In a South African context, we refer to a cost to company or a guaranteed package model structure. And that is, I want to say, unique in our specific context and not really adopted elsewhere in the world. So I'm going to bring up the second poll in the specific structure. Ollie, if you can please post the poll for us in this specific one, and we will allow the participants to submit the responses along. You cannot, I want to say, take a uniform approach when looking at reward. There are different market nuances that exist. So I also think about this when we do the annual salary review process. We always want to work with clean data. But the question is, how clean do you want your data? There's no such thing as perfect data. It doesn't exist. It's nearing perfection. It's almost like when you do research, you near saturation. You never achieve saturation. So your ability to get to the best possible one-size-fits-all approach will probably cover 60% of your countries if you are a multinational across the board. But if you are not a multinational across the board, you won't just have one uniform approach in your reward solution because you want to be unique in your approach. There's different tax and legislative reasons in terms of how this is managed. I think in Ghana, a company that I work for quite extensively said that they only found out recently that bonuses are taxed on previous tax regimes, which is something that I didn't know until this week. So another interesting component. So Ollie, you can bring up the poll results for us while I talk to the next slide about total rewards. So the bulk of the people in terms of feedback said that they're equally important concepts that can build a great employee value proposition. And it's true that they are different, but they are similar. So rewards is an overarching component. And this model, so thank you very much, Ollie. So the model that we're going to share now is a well-known model by World at Work. And it talks about the 5 components of total rewards. We start at the top with compensation, also known as remuneration. I think it's very much an American term to talk about compensation. I heard Professor Alex, I think it's Alex Edmonds, speak from London School of Economics, that compensation is something that you get paid after you've won a court case. So let's not talk about compensation because our employees don't lodge court cases against us. Let's talk about the remuneration. So he's proposed approach. So we can actually adapt this framework slightly. But there's also 4 other components. Work-life balance, that it's typically assisted through employee assistance programs, EAPs, and we have a larger conversation around this now in terms of work flexibility. How do we accommodate working across different time zones? How do we accommodate different cultures? The DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion, or equality conversation that's going on, and being intentional about these changes is exceptional. Training and development, that's your longer-term HR interventions that take place. And Ollie's our head of learning, and he's really shared so much around the multiple engagements and longer-term view that organizations should take on this. Bottom left-hand corner, recognition and performance management. Once again, our first study showed that organizations are slow to adopt their performance management systems in this new ways of working or new world of work that we need. And then finally, benefits. Benefits typically consisting of employer contributions to pension, medical, or risk insurance. And risk insurance is group life or group disability in case you are in an accident. And these are often, I want to say, the hidden components. One that does not focus here is mobility. How do we actually upskill people? Some would argue that it's part of training and development. Well, what kind of mobility are we talking about? Are we talking about developmental assignments, professional assignments, career assignments, project assignees? How do we define that? And that's a whole area of expertise around talking around that specific component. So compensation is typically structured in this manner. Compensation typically has got two components, fixed and variable. Fixed is what you are guaranteed to receive on an annualized basis. Variable, which typically has two components, short-term incentives and long-term incentives. As I've mentioned earlier on, short-term incentives over a 12-month or less period, long-term incentives over a longer-term period. Long-term incentives, typically you will get your equity schemes or your cash schemes. You can also have phantom schemes. So it's a scheme that mirrors what the share price would have looked like in an organization. So this is the main remuneration or compensation component that's available to organizations. Very interesting talk I watched the other day said that on the fixed component, any increase less than 5%, employees deem as irrelevant. So it needs to be greater than 5% for the employees to feel like it actually has made a difference. If we look at, they would rather have a lump sum payment of a lower amount than actually have an increase of 5%. So that's interesting research coming out of, I think it was Walter University out of Belgium, a professor that heads up their remuneration department there. Short-term incentives, what is the behavior that we want to drive? Does it make an impact? What's the purpose of the incentive and how is it structured? Salespeople, are we paying sales commissions? Are we paying incentives? Are we paying performance-based bonuses? Are we double dipping? Do we have multiple schemes? Do we have one scheme? Can really get quite complex and not even want to talk about the long-term incentives, which theoretically should be easy, but practically it's almost impossible to administer in an organization, specifically on a global scheme and also from a tax point of view. It really is difficult. I really love this slide. You know, I asked when Oliver asked to do the presentation, I said, can I do it in Excel instead of PowerPoint? Now, there's two people that I follow on YouTube. It's Layla. I struggle to pronounce, I think it's Harami, and then Kenji. Kenji knows, he's a risk analyst out of US. And I've really come quite accustomed to working with Excel. And Excel, in my view, is really one of the most powerful tools as a reward practitioner that you have and that you can use. You can often amaze people by doing shortcuts and drawing up spreadsheets. And the Excel capabilities have also enhanced with the future roll-ups and updates that has been implemented in the system, which has been of incredible value. So if we then look at the third pillar around structuring reward effectively, and what does this mean for an organization? There's this theory about generational theory to say, well, let's pay all the Gen Z, the Gen X's, the Gen Y's in a similar fashion. But then organizations started to do research and identify personas. And I would like to liken this with the support of a football team. So you can't say that all between 20 and 30-year-old employees support Liverpool, and between 30 and 40 support Manchester United, and between 40 and 50 supports Chelsea. There's a mix of people in this spectrum. So how, as an organization, do you structure your reward effectively to cater to this mix across your organization? Your ability to allow flexibility to suit people's lifestyle. As an example, can we withhold pension contributions for a specific period, 1 to 2 years, at the onset of employment, for younger people to faster pay off their bonds or to pay off other debt that they might have, student loan debt? Can people encash their leave? Can people buy leave? What is the flexibility that we allow on a benefits provision? This pyramid, designed out of Singapore by the Skills Future, drafted these three components. Says that your engagement with people takes place on 3 levels: contractual, emotional, and purpose. Or contractual, emotional, or experience and emotional. And emotional, I use the word purpose there to say that the base of the pyramid, the foundation, is contractual. Everybody needs to do that. The experiences are unique at different organizations. But what really makes people stay at organizations is this emotional connection. Are they aligned to the broader purpose of the organization? And what organizations do will make them stay, will make them contribute to the highest level of their ability. So organizations can't differentiate on contractual except by how much. And how much, there's always someone else with the ability to pay more than the organization that you work for in this specific context. This specific slide is really the McKinsey 7S model structured sideways. Just to say that, what is the business strategy? We have been structured by function, which is in my opinion, a terrible way to structure organizations, because people always work in silos. You can't breach the gaps in organizations. And then from an HR point of view, what are the pillars that are important for us? Now, we've just given some examples here. And we can see that the reward is an outflow of the people strategy. Are we setting up in a market? Are we closing down? Are we, at which phase of the business life cycle are we in? That will be one of the components that will inform our reward strategy. What should the focus be on fixed? Are we needing to attract? What should the focus be on variable? Are we a startup that can pay more in equity and less in fixed base? What is the risk horizon that we're looking at in this specific context? So when I look at this, I always say, well, I don't know what's going on in the learning space. I just always go back and say, if I don't know what's going on in the learning space, what is my business strategy and how do I align my learning strategy in pockets through the organization to that? Now, just want to touch briefly on statistics in the next couple of slides. And I really want to talk about the 3 types of statistics that exists. And all of these statistics that we're going to talk through, you'll be able to calculate in Excel with various formulas, very basic courses that you can run on Excel. So typically there are 3 kinds of statistics: descriptive, normative, and informative statistics. And descriptive statistics tells you something about the data set. For instance, there are 34 people in the data set. It describes the data set. And here are some descriptive statistics that is often used in remuneration. We'll talk about the range. Mean and average is the same thing. Mean is the terminology, the US terminology for an average. Median is the midpoint of the market. Median, 50th percentile, midpoint, same thing, different words. Then we've got a maximum and a minimum. So we don't talk about 0 and 100, but we rather talk about maximum and minimum. But there's a different way of sharing this. And this is on a continuum. So we will have the minimum salary that's paid and the maximum salary that's paid. And from a remuneration point of view, we can divide this in what we refer to in quarters, or then refer to as quartiles. Quartiles means it's a specific point. So 25th percentile means that 25% of the data is below this point and 75% of the data is above this point. 50th percentile, 50% below, 50% above. 75th percentile, 75% below a point, 25% above that specific point. The distance between the 25th and 75th percentile is referred to as the interquartile range. Now, the average is a floating point. It's not a fixed point. And where the average is positioned in relation to the market median, 50th percentile or midpoint, remember that's the same thing, tells you something about the data set. Remember, we're talking about descriptive statistics. If your average is greater than your median, it tells me that there are outliers to the top. If your average is lower than your median, it tells me that there are outliers to the. Now, when we work with our internal data, we have the whole population, and we prefer to work with average data. But whenever we work with market data, we would use statistical data and the quartiles, 25th percentile, 50th percentile, 75th percentile, because we're only working with a sample of the overall data set. So when we compare our data to market data, we always compare our average point to the market data because we've got all the data in our data set. And this is just an example of what the different distribution of data can look like. Data can either be skewed to the right, to the left, which is positively skewed. It's a metrical distribution, also known as your data points are all the same. Then we start to talk about in terms of a mean, a mode, and a midpoint. So mode is just the number that appears the most in a data set. So mode is not something that we would use in a reward context because it's not really relevant to us. But from time to time, you may want to make certain distinctions on this. For instance, if you want to look at performance distributions, you want to look at the mode, what is the performance ranking that appears the most? And this, once again, shapes a story. So then you look at the curve of your distribution. So you get three kinds of curve: platokurtic, leptokurtic, mesokurtic. And that just shows you what you would refer to as the peakedness, how high the curve goes, or is it a relatively flat curve, like a mountain? And this is more technical components around reward and the analysis. We also can start to talk about correlation and future predictions. So I really love working with people and numbers, and I often find that many HR people don't necessarily share that passion. But what I have found is that there are other people in organizations that like to do these calculations. Often a great partner in the organization is finance. People in finance loves running the numbers, working in Excel. So if you are a reward practitioner, HR practitioner, and you're not au fait with running these numbers yourself, outsource it. I love doing that as an organization, to say, who can I bring in? And that can potentially become part of their career development plan and entry into the reward sphere as a participant in the organization. So the next couple of slides that we are going to look at is the starting to close off the presentation. So looking at from a rewards governance point of view, and we are going to look at governance structures. There is guidance globally referred to as King 4 principles or the King guidelines, which is always of value to read as an organization. Now, first of all, talking about drawing up pay scales. You need a couple of things to draw up pay scales. You need market data, whatever that chosen market data is, whether it's an industry, a peer group, a subset of data, national data, all country data across different geographies. You need internal data. You correlate between the two, and the correlation is to say, how are we comparing apples with apples? This is where the grading can play the interface or the bridge between the two, because you can say a grade 1 in the market is equal to grade 7 in our organization, and this is how we map this. We then overlay this onto one another, and we then start to structure the comparisons and doing our budgeting calculations from there. So a pay range, as I've alluded to before, I've showed you a picture of a pay range, is where we define the minimum and the maximum of where we ideally want to pay for a job. And then based on the 3P model, we place a person in that specific pay range to say, based on your competencies, your experience, your availability of the skills that you have in the market, do you come at a premium? Do you come at a discount? And that is where the compa ratio comes into play. In this example, the previous example, we divided it into 5 zones. Here we've divided it into 4 zones: first quartile, second quartile, third and fourth quartile. You should be a little bit more comfortable with the statistics. Maximum on top, minimum at the bottom. And this is how you can structure it from a quartile point of view. So where do we pay people? And this unlocks a whole new discussion around how transparent should we be about disclosing pay to our people? Should we say that we pay, or that you are paid in the third quartile, in the fourth quartile? What do you need to do to get to the fourth quartile? And I still find that organizations still guard where people are paid in the organizations in most instances. This is another example of where we can say, instead of saying first quartile, second, third, or fourth quartile, we say that people are paid in a premium zone or a competence zone or developmental zone. So it's different ways of expressing the data that we are looking at in this specific context. And this is now what a full salary structure, so salary structure or pay bands, would look like. It's the multiple single pay ranges grouped together to form one structure. And you can either do this for the organization as a whole, or if there's a higher level of complexity, do it by family. Have one for HR, IT, operations, engineering. That, however, brings the higher level of administration. And the question that we need to ask is it worth having multiple pay ranges versus single pay ranges, and maybe just broadening your pay ranges as an organization? Compa ratio, which I've spoken about briefly. So compa ratio is how do you compete where you are positioned? So you can't always express data in terms of currency. If you are present in multiple countries, if you say you pay in 3,000 pesos or you're paying 70,000 yen, doesn't necessarily make sense. So we try to express this as a percentage, and that percentage is a compa ratio. So in this example at the bottom, we're just saying that the actual pay is 12,000 and the midpoint is 10,000. So we say 12,000 divided by 10,000, which is 120%. and the 120% is the compare ratio. So how do you compare in that specific range? And in this instance, the person is paid 20% above. So 20% above means that they are being paid as a premium. And then on an individual basis, we will look into the detail around where people are paid. From a benefits point of view, organizations I still think are very patriarchal in their approach, offering retirement, medical, and risk insurance. There's, of course, other benefits that are offered, learning and development training at an ad hoc basis. But we see that on the continent specifically, very few training days per calendar year are actually spent on training. I think it added up to like 1.3%, and only 2.2% of profit is typically spent on training. So small percentages, yet we live in the fourth industrial revolution. And I hear now we're moving away from the fourth industrial revolution, talking about more society 5.0 with the inflection of the metaverse and how we collaborate. Interesting conference in Spain 2 to 3 weeks ago that was attended by another colleague that said that people are talking about the metaverse now as what people were talking about the internet in the late 90s. This is the reality. This is coming. How do we prepare and how do we brace for this to live in this society 5.0? Edward Deming, one of our favorite quotes as an organization, says, without data, just another person with an opinion, is to say, if you structure all of this correctly, you bring facts to the table and you have a base of departure, once again, removing that emotional connectedness to the discussion that you're having with your specific stakeholders. So let's make evidence-based decision-making. What is the data that you bring to the table, not my opinion or my gut feel? And this is really something that we see is taken off, but still I see most organizations taking decisions based on gut feel and a lack of evidence, empirical evidence specifically. So from a reward governance point of view, which is really the closing remarks before I hand back to Ollie to wrap up the session for us, is what are the reward governance components that should ideally be in place in an organization? We work quite a bit with family-owned businesses which want to enforce a stricter level of governance based on an increased external shareholder relationship that exists. And the first thing that we try to say is that, are you sure you want to have this higher level of governance imposed on you as an organization? And often they don't have a choice. But governance is hard work, and it means that we are structuring policies and we are structuring procedures, and through that embedding practices in our organization to make sound principle-based decisions. So there's several principles that can guide this, of which one is to focus on saying, we've got pay ranges, we've graded our jobs, we follow a structure, we've got a remuneration policy, we've embedded this specific remuneration system in our organization, and this is how we manage it. And of course, making tweaks as we go along. Often the board or the chairman will delegate his responsibility to a remuneration committee or a REMCO if it's a bigger organization. If it's a smaller organization, we see that the executive committee typically makes the decisions around reward, centralized around the leader, general manager, the managing director, or the country CEO of that specific organization leading the discussion in that specific context. So reward governance is a maturing practice. And from my experience, it is a journey. It's a little bit like risk management. Risk management is not about the destination. It's actually about the journey that you embark on. And as HR and reward professionals, we would often be placed under a tremendous amount of pressure to get to an outcome that the stakeholder wants versus enforcing the policy and practices that have been agreed upon. So it's in this instance where ethics plays a significant role in the implementation of specific structures. So on that note, I would like to say thank you very much to everybody that joined us for the call. It was a jam-packed 50 minutes in terms of the context. We would like to hear more from you in terms of what you would like to see more of in the coming weeks for us to host in the coming quarters and so forth, for you as a reward fraternity, and what we can share with you and also learn from you in our approach moving forward. Ali, back to you.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for a great presentation. Thank you, folks, for your questions. Nicole, I think we have about 4 minutes left. There are a few questions here. Perhaps we can do a very short Q&A. Tanusha asks, and I think she's left the call, but this may benefit others. Can you please say more on salary review strategies being deployed to mitigate impact of high inflationary countries and or currency depreciation eroding salary increases in Africa?
Yeah, so I think, we live in an environment where inflation is a reality. Milton Friedman said that addressing monetary concerns with additional money only to increase your monetary concern. So inflation comes about when there is a demand for products and not necessarily an excess supply of the product, so people are willing to pay more. Or for instance, I spoke about Malawi and the devaluation of the currency. So the prices of imported goods are going to increase. So as a starting point, the labor market dynamics determines the rate of pay for a specific role, not the inflation or the cost of living in a country. So I think I've got a specific view on inflation, but many organizations use inflation as a proxy. Now, if you're going to use inflation as a proxy, make sure that you commit to this full term. Like we saw in Venezuela a couple of years ago, inflation over the thousands of percentage points. To say, if we say we give an inflationary increase, then make it so. Then keep up with inflation. But as I mentioned, typically there's a disconnect. So I would say frequent reviews, address the concern. If the concern is fuel prices being increased, actually address the fuel price concern. If the price of food is increased, address the price of food that's being concerned. Try to not make a decision that will impact you over the long term. Implement an allowance that can potentially be taken away. Make it non-pensionable, non-bonusable, and structure it in that manner. There is no one silver bullet here, because if there was, organizations would have done it. We must know that inflation will always drive up salaries, and typically salaries is a laggard. Increases in salaries is a laggard effect of inflation, typically with about 3 to 6 months. And often organizations will say, we will address this in the annual review. So I would say be cautious to say that you align to inflation as an organization, but as an organization, know what drives the inflation. As an instance, Malawi, it's the forex shortages. So they devalued the local currency to make the export market more attractive so that they can get more foreign currency reserve to bolster their economy and therefore help with the IMF funding that they require. So there's different reasons why organizations, so devaluation is not always a bad thing. It makes your country economy more attractive. But Malawi, once again, 10 years ago, the kwacha was 160 kwacha, devalued to 250, 260 odd kwacha. Now it's over 1,000. So it typically trends in one direction only. But I would say keep away of the economic drivers in the market.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Ladies and gents, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our webinar. We have no time left to answer questions. Please, however, follow us on LinkedIn and take the opportunity to engage with us on LinkedIn. We love having conversations with our various stakeholders, so do engage with us there. And also, if you have not had the chance yet, please do complete our new ways of working Pan-African Insight study for 2022. This is the second year we are running the study, and we would love to see what you have to say in terms of how new ways of working are emerging in your organization, in your context, and in your country. I've just popped the link to the chat, to the new ways of working study into the chat, and we look forward to your responses. We will send you these slides as well as a recording of this webinar. But from me, that's it. Thank you very, very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you. Bye.